Welcome to a journey through one of the most curious chapters in World War II aviation history. Today we'll explore the daring and unorthodox designs of Blohm Voss, a company renowned for thinking outside of the box in pursuit of innovative aircraft. Seatbelts fastened? Well, let's nose dive in. During the late 1930s and early 40s, the Luftwaffe was a formidable force, rapidly modernizing to achieve air superiority to support Germany's expansionist goals. Now, German aircraft such as the Messerschmitt Bf-109, the Focke-Wulf Fw-190, and the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka had already made their mark. These airplanes excelled in specific roles, but ongoing campaigns highlighted certain shortcomings. The Ju-87, for instance, was undeniably effective in the early phases of the war, especially for its precision dive-bombing role. However, it soon became apparent that the Stuka's relatively slow speed, outdated defenses, and lack of flexibility made it vulnerable to ever-improving Allied fighters. By the time that the war had turned against Germany, especially after the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe recognized the need for upgraded or entirely new designs. These had to satisfy requirements for survivability, speed, firepower, and versatility. Meanwhile, Allied bomber raids were intensifying, and the skies over Europe were increasingly dominated by enemy fighters. German command had pressing demands for advanced fighters to counter threats like the P-51 Mustang or the Supermarine Spitfire. Even so, there was still room for novel bomber projects designed to replace or supplement existing aircraft. It was in this climate of urgency and fierce competition that Blohm Voss proposed several audacious concepts, including the P192 and P193. Now, Blohm Voss might be more famously recognized as a prominent shipbuilding company, but an aviation division that they created gained an unexpected reputation for daring ideas. Founded in the late 19th century primarily as a maritime construction firm, Blohm Voss eventually diversified into aircraft production under the moniker Hamburger Flugzeugbau. Now, over time, the aviation arm adopted the Blohm Voss name, focusing on seaplanes and flying boats before exploring more radical land-based concepts. Part of this unconventional approach was driven by engineer Richard Vogt, whose imaginative designs frequently defied traditional aerodynamic norms. Among Blohm Voss's more memorable creations was the asymmetric BV-141 reconnaissance aircraft, which placed the crew pod on one side of the fuselage and the engine on the other. Such out-of-the-box thinking was indeed typical of the company's design philosophy. While many of these designs were overshadowed by more conventional options from Messerschmitt and Heinkel, Blohm Voss remained eager to stand out with solutions that were as inventive as they were unorthodox. By the early 40s, the Stuka had proven its worth in blitzkrieg operations, terrorizing ground forces and ships with accuracy. However, it had become slower and more vulnerable each year, as Allied fighter technology rapidly advanced. In response, German aviation experts explored multiple new ideas to produce a successor that was capable of combining precise dive bombing with improved speed, maneuverability, and defense capabilities. The Blohm Voss P192 was one such endeavor. Proposed as a low-set wing aircraft with a forward cockpit arrangement and a strikingly unique engine configuration, the P192 was meant to achieve near-vertical dive capabilities akin to the Stuka, while offering enhanced performance. Now, designed around a piston engine, the P192 placed its propeller somewhat mid-fuselage, ahead of a tail boom arrangement and behind a smaller forward structure. This layout was already an unusual departure from the typical nose or tail-mounted prop designs of the day. Now, because German military command had already grown used to outlandish proposals, at least on paper, from Blohm Voss, the P192 and its bizarre lines didn't immediately discourage them. In fact, the top brass was open to pretty much anything that promised a leap forward in dive-bombing technology. And for a time, it appeared that the P192 might actually have a chance to reach a prototype stage. But as the war situation worsened for the Axis, any design that seemed too risky or unconventional faced more scrutiny. The P192 was envisioned as a single-engine, low-wing monoplane with a distinctive tail boom and mid-fuselage propeller arrangement. One of the crucial elements was the plane's center of gravity, which Blohm Voss aimed to optimize by shifting weight more centrally. By placing the propeller in the middle of the aircraft body, engineers hoped to reduce some of the torque and balancing issues encountered with the traditional nose mount layout. Now, this approach was theoretically beneficial for stabilizing the airplane during steep dives and pulling out quickly once bombs had been released. An interesting aspect of the P192 was the small forward fuselage section that was situated ahead of the propeller assembly. This structure was intended to house the cockpit and possibly some navigational or targeting equipment, allowing the pilot better visibility downward when lining up targets. Blohm and Voss designers recognized that ground attack and dive bombing required excellent forward and downward fields of view. The smaller nose area meant less obstruction, theoretically improving the pilot's situational awareness. In terms of armament, the P192 was projected to carry bombs internally or on external hardpoints. Although the exact bomb load capacity remains speculative, archival documents suggest that Blohm and Voss was aiming for at least a comparable load to the Ju-87. The plan was also to fit the aircraft with forward-firing cannons or machine guns for strafing runs and to provide some measure of air-to-air defense. In the late war climate, heavy armament was always under consideration, so one could imagine that if it was fully realized, the P192 might have carried 20mm or even 30mm cannons in its wings or forward section. Another interesting choice was the landing gear configuration. Though specifics are sparse, the low-set wings likely would have accommodated a conventional landing gear setup, retracting into fairings or wing recesses. Given the unusual fuselage shape and the mid-body propeller, the tail section might have required a more robust assembly to support the plane during landings. Landing gear on a design this radical is no trivial matter, requiring that engineers carefully distribute weight across the airframe to prevent tipping or balancing issues. Now, part of what made the Stuka so iconic, and in some ways so feared early on, was its ability to get close to the target, release bombs then with an uncanny accuracy due to a steep dive, and then pull out, albeit somewhat clumsily by later standards. But Blohm and Voss wanted to retain or even improve that capability in the P192. A mid-body propeller might, in theory, allow the aircraft to achieve a more balanced dive, with more predictable handling because the mass and thrust points were more centralized. The forward cockpit section, with a relatively unobstructed view, would be a boon to the pilot. No longer would a large radial engine or inline engine block significant swaths of forward fields of vision. Now, the engineers of Blohm and Voss also toyed with the idea of integrating advanced dive brakes or slats to maintain stable, controlled dives. By carefully placing aerodynamic features around the wings or fuselage, the plane could remain steady during a near-vertical approach, releasing bombs at a precise location. The P192 was intended to bring the best aspects of the Ju-87, pinpoint bombing, but then combine it with a modern framework that had more potential for speed and agility. If everything had gone to plan, the P192 might have exceeded the Stuka's performance across the board, giving the Luftwaffe a much-needed leg up in tactical bombing. Now, despite these theoretical advantages, the P192 was ultimately met with a lot of skepticism. The mid-body propeller arrangement, small forward fuselage, and tail boom design, it seemed unnecessarily complicated for an Air Force that increasingly had no time or resources to waste on unproven technologies. Even within Blohm and Voss, there were undoubtedly internal voices that were questioning whether the P192 represented a feasible path forward or just an engineering dead end. The RLM saw the airplane's complexity as a potential manufacturing bottleneck, especially as German industrial infrastructure began feeling the pressure of Allied strategic bombing. The battle for raw materials was quite intense, and aluminum shortages, among other issues, were becoming crippling. Designing and assembling a radical new fuselage might involve specialized tooling and processes, further complicating the production lines. While Germany was open to innovative concepts, there was still a practical dimension. Any new aircraft had to be buildable quickly and easily, using parts and assemblies that didn't disrupt existing supply chains. Costs were another factor. By the time the P192 was being proposed, the war's tide had shifted, and Germany's resources were getting stretched thin. The need for advanced fighters to stave off Allied bombers and provide some semblance of aerial defense overshadowed bomber or dive bomber projects, adding to the P192's woes. Rival proposals such as improved versions of the Ju-88 or brand new types from other manufacturers might have seemed more straightforward to develop. The fact that the P192 was so distinctive worked against it, ironically, at a moment when the Luftwaffe was starved for proven, easily producible solutions. Now, in an attempt to salvage the concept and address the criticisms leveled at the P192, Blohm and Voss tweaked the design to produce the P193. Where the P192's propeller was placed in the middle, the P193 moved it then to the tail, adopting a pusher configuration. This adjustment instantly solved some of the more glaring issues, such as engine cooling and forward visibility. Putting the propeller at the rear also improved the aerodynamics for a steep dive, at least in theory, since the nose was now completely free of obstructions. Like its predecessor, the P193 was intended as a single-engine low-wing monoplane. The fuselage was similarly slender, though somewhat more traditional in silhouette, save for the pusher prop at the back. There were plans for a tricycle landing gear arrangement, or possibly a conventional one, though records are incomplete regarding the final choice. The cockpit remained forward, offering the pilot a commanding view, vital for low-level attacks. Though the P193 was arguably more practical than the P192, it still faced significant headwinds. The fundamental question within German aviation circles remained whether the Luftwaffe truly needed another dive bomber at all when fighter escorts and improved fighter bombers might more effectively carry out ground attack roles. The evolution from dedicated dive bombers to versatile fighter bombers was already well underway in air forces around the world. Now, detailed specifications for the P193 are sparse, but Blohm Voss were likely aiming for a plane that can match or exceed speeds in the 350 to 400 mile an hour range when in level flight. If the design used a late-war German engine like the Daimler-Benz DB603 or the Junkers Jumo 213, it might have produced 1,750 to 2,000 horsepower, giving it a reasonable performance envelope. With a planned bomb load of around 1,000 to 15,000 kilograms, the P193 would have been in the ballpark of other ground attack planes of the period, though it was by no means intended to rival the heavy bombers. Armament layouts might have included wing-mounting 22mm cannons, possibly a pair or more, to produce robust ground strafing capabilities. Some documents hint at the possibility of installing a forward-firing 30mm cannon, a fearsome weapon that might have been effective against Allied armor. Like the P192, the P193's calling card remained the ability to enter a dive with stability and then exit rapidly, allowing it to deliver bombs with quite a bit of precision. Even so, the Luftwaffe was under immense strain and focus had shifted to interceptors and high-speed fighters by this stage of the war. By the time the P192 and P193 were on drawing boards, Blohm & Voss had already established a reputation for eyebrow-raising designs. Aircraft like the BV-141 asymmetrical reconnaissance plane underscored the company's willingness to deviate from standard practice. The BV-238 flying boat, one of the largest ever built, also cemented Blohm & Voss as a firm unafraid of tackling huge and unusual projects. Now, this tradition of risk-taking was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it encouraged creativity and sometimes led to breakthroughs. On the other, it could alienate those within the RLM who preferred more incremental improvements over radical leaps. With the war reaching critical stages, Germany's aviation establishment was no longer in a position to gamble on uncertain designs. Even if Blohm & Voss had managed to produce prototypes of the P192 or P193, there was no guarantee that these aircraft could have progressed beyond experimental status before the war was over. A key reason why the P192 and 193 remained paper projects is that by 1944 and 1945, Germany was desperate for air superiority. The Allies were conducting massive strategic bombing campaigns that devastated German industry, infrastructure, and cities. Stopping or at least diminishing these raids was a top priority, leading to an ever-increasing emphasis on fighters like the Focke-Wulf TA-152, the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet, and others. Developing new types of bombers or dive bombers, no matter how innovative, fell by the wayside. The Luftwaffe's doctrines, once reliant on terrorizing ground forces and supporting fast-moving panzers, was pivoting to defensive operations. The close air support niche was largely filled by modifications of existing fighters, like the FW-190 in ground attack roles, or even the Henschel HS-129, which specialized in anti-armor missions. The P-192 and 193 arrived at the moment when these sorts of specialized bombers were losing their priority. The RLM and the Luftwaffe needed something that could operate effectively in a sky that was teeming with Allied fighter escorts. Now, had the P-192 and P-193 been developed earlier, they might have seen service as potent dive bombers or ground attackers. The mid or rear propeller placement would have likely aided in pilot visibility, allowing for more accurate bomb runs. An advanced engine might have given these aircraft speed enough to outpace older Allied fighter models, but only for a time. Blohm & Voss were forward-thinking enough to consider building them with armor to protect vital components, given the vulnerability that dive bombers often faced from ground fire. In a hypothetical scenario where one of these designs reached operational status around 1942 or 43, they could potentially have seen extensive action on the Eastern Front, where the Ju-87 was still serving but showing signs of obsolescence. Now, a faster, more maneuverable design might have been a significant asset in supporting ground troops. However, the Allies were also rapidly improving their ground attack capabilities and fighter technology, meaning any new German aircraft would face stiff competition. No matter how imaginative or promising a design appeared on paper, it had to overcome considerable political and logistical hurdles to make it to the prototype stage, let alone full production. By the mid-war period, the German aviation industry was increasingly centralized, with the government dictating which programs would be prioritized. Messerschmitt, Focke-Wulf, and Heinkel commanded significant influence and had established relationships with major subcontractors. Blohm Voss, while respected for their boldness, was still something of an outsider in the mainstream world of fighter and bomber production. There was also the real possibility that test data would not align with the theoretical advantages. Mid-fuselage or pusher propeller arrangements had rarely been used in large-scale production aircraft, and for good reason. They posed unique challenges in cooling, vibration, and aerodynamic stability. Even if Blohm and Voss could solve these problems, it would require extensive research and testing that the war's accelerating tempo might not allow. Moreover, as Allied forces advanced and resources dwindled, the impetus for yet another dive bomber design evaporated. The German High Command shifted focus to revolutionary technologies like the Me-262 jet fighter or the V-2 rocket, seeing these as game changers that might turn the tide. Against such dramatic backdrops, a quirky piston-engine dive bomber had minimal political or strategic traction. Now, Germany was not alone in pursuing unconventional ideas during World War II. Nearly all of the major powers were experimenting. The United States had the XP-55 Ascender, a pusher fighter with a canard, while the Soviet Union toyed with unusual prototypes as well. Blohm & Voss, however, stood out for the sheer number of concepts that challenged standard designs. The P192 and 193 followed that lineage, much like the earlier BV-141. Despite superficial similarities to other pusher projects worldwide, Blohm & Voss's focus was on specialized dive bombing and ground attack, not air superiority. If anything, the P193 had more in common with certain ground attack concepts that placed an emphasis on pilot visibility and armor protection. The mid or rear engine placement was sometimes considered to keep the nose free for heavy armament or better pilot vantage, but while certain prototypes in the Soviet Union did see limited production, Blohm & Voss's proposals never reached that far. The question remains whether the P192 or 93 could have been a real game changer or just another interesting footnote. Today, these Blohm & Voss designs are studied for their ingenuity and as a reminder of how war accelerates innovation. Aviation historians continue to sift through archived drawings and engineering notes, marveling at the audacity on display. In an age long after the conclusion of World War II, these planes symbolize both the tremendous creative energy of German aircraft designers and the strategic missteps that often accompanied their efforts. For enthusiasts of experimental aviation, P192 and 193 occupy a special place. They're what-if machines, reflective of an era when new ideas could quite literally tilt the balance of power. The war ended before these planes could ever fly, and it's an open question whether they would have performed as advertised. From a purely aesthetic perspective, they highlight the same visionary mindset that gave us the BV-141 or the Me-264 America bomber. The concept is just never let conventional wisdom constrain your thinking. One of the main selling points of the P192 and 193 was the potential for upgraded armament compared to the Ju-87. By late in the war, Stuka variants were sometimes outfitted with cannons for anti-tank roles, but these modifications strained an already aging platform. Blohm & Voss aimed to integrate a more robust weapon set from the start, possibly introducing multiple forward-firing cannons in the wings or fuselage. The bomb load could have been flexible, allowing the plane to carry already anything from small fragmentation bombs for infantry attacks to larger specialized ordnance for bunker busting or anti-ship operations. Dive bombing demanded strong air brakes, reinforcement around bomb racks to handle G-forces, and sophisticated aiming equipment. Blohm & Voss intended to incorporate all these features while maintaining a more aerodynamic and modern profile. Now, though the Ju-87 had proven its worth early in the war, fresh design might have revived Germany's dive bombing capabilities if it had arrived at the right time and in enough numbers. Today, these planes serve as a reminder of the frantic search for a technological edge that characterized late-war Germany. In that sense, the P192 and P193 are part of a broader narrative of ambitious projects that never quite made it off the page. Their appeal for modern audiences lies in their unique aesthetic, unconventional engineering choices, and the tantalizing question of what might have been. A deeper legacy is the lesson that big risks require significant resources, time, and a stable environment, all of which, at that time, were in short supply. While some projects like the Me-262 highlight how radical innovation can yield real results, Countless other efforts demonstrate the pitfalls of untested ideas in a high-stakes race. And in the end, the P192 and 193 exist as historical curiosities, footnotes in an era of intense competition and rapidly shifting military priorities. Now, from a modern standpoint, these projects reaffirm that World War II was a crucible for rapid technological advancement. The conflict spurred everything from jet engines to advanced rocketry, shaping the post-war aviation industry. Amid that whirlwind of innovation, not every idea could be realized. Some, like the P192 and 193, would forever remain on paper, but their significance lies in their demonstration of the era's inventive spirit. In the post-war world, many German engineers were recruited or migrated to other countries, contributing to advanced programs in the US, the Soviet Union, and elsewhere. It's not inconceivable that lessons learned, or even design elements from these shelved projects, influence future generations of aircraft. At the very least, the concept of optimizing pilot visibility and rethinking airframe geometry, it didn't vanish. Many post-war designs, especially close air support planes, put a premium on a wide field of view and heavily armored cockpits. We hope you found this deep dive into Blohm Voss's daring P192 and 193 as intriguing as we do. Now, these planes remain tantalizing glimpses of what might have replaced the venerable Stuka, had the circumstances been different. Their stories echo the broader challenges of wartime innovation and highlights just how quickly priorities can change. It's not hard to admire the creativity that drove these radical designs. If you enjoyed this look into aviation history's quirkiest corners, please consider subscribing to our channel for more fascinating explorations. From lost prototypes to legendary warbirds, we love sharing all sides of the aviation story. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.